In this video, I'd just like to take a brief look at the very elegantly named MySQL dump feature. This is the application that we use to back up the database. And what we do when we back it up is we create a plain text file, human-readable. We can usually put it into a .sql file, although the extension doesn't really matter. You can call it anything you want. And the way that we restore a backup is to source this file. So if you've been following along with the videos, we've already created some SQL files that we can source, but this is how we will dump an entire database into a file that we can source, and we can share that database or back it up, whatever we want to do with it. Now, on Mac and Linux, what we're going to do is run MySQL dump in the terminal window from the command line. We will not be in MySQL. We do this from the terminal window, the Unix, Linux command line outside of MySQL. On Windows, we run it directly from the MySQL shell, and again, not having gotten into MySQL. So we do this from outside MySQL. We don't do this from inside the database itself. And so as you see down here at the bottom, there are a number of switches that we can give, or parameters that we can give to MySQL dump. There are a ton of these, and I'll show you in just a second where to go to find more. But we add switches to tell MySQL dump exactly what we want and what we don't want. And so we'll look at those in just a second. The one that I use, that is listed here, is the one that I use about 98% of the time. so I'm just going to give this one to you as the basic one, but feel free to alter the switches later. So again, what's going to happen is we're going to invoke MySQL dump, and that's the thing on the left there, obviously MySQL dump. And what we send to it then are a series of switches. So these are the usual login suspects. So that says that I'm going to log in as a particular user, so -u, and that says take the next word and use that as my username. Here I'm logging in as root. You might log in as something else. I log in as something else, but that's fine. And the -p says ask me for my password, but do it on the next line and then don't show anybody. Now, what's interesting about those two switches is that they have one hyphen, right? One minus sign. And you'll notice that the other ones here have two. So these are the single switches here, the single minus signs are kind of interactivity, right? So use the following thing as my username. Ask me for my password on the next line. The next one, though, you'll notice is hyphen databases. And what that says is interpret any other kind of non-switch parameters that I'm going to give you, just interpret those as database names. Now here you can see towards the end, this is one is Dickens. Imagine we had a database called Dickens that we're backing up. And so this is like a binary switch. It's either on or it's off. And that's why these have two minus signs in front of them. So if I left that off, it would just, it's like a light switch. So I'm turning on the light switch and I'm saying anything that doesn't have minus signs and doesn't look like a parameter, just pretend that that's a database name. And so I'm turning on that action or that feature. The next one here is that I'm going to add a drop database SQL statement into the backup file. So what will happen when I load this again, or when I source this, is that MySQL will drop that database, that is to say delete the entire database if it exists, and then it will recreate it from scratch. So if the database happened to be, for example, corrupted on the hard drive in some way, this will get rid of the old one and we'll just reinstall an entire new one. So we're basically starting from scratch, and I think that's a good thing to add. So I almost always add the add drop database switch. Again, think of it as a light switch. It's either on, or if I leave it out, it's off. And in here, obviously, what I'm doing, well, maybe obviously, maybe not, is this is the name of the database that I want to dump. So imagine that you have a database called Dickens, and that -- databases switch says, oh, now when you get to something that doesn't have a minus sign in front of it, please interpret that as the name of a database. Now I could list a couple here, and that would be fine. This little arrow key, or the greater than symbol, is a routing symbol. Now if I don't route my info or my dump file anywhere, it'll just show up on the terminal window, and I could read it, but it doesn't do me any good there. So what I want to do is I want to say, don't send it to the terminal window, but instead, please route it to a file which I will give you next. And then obviously here, this is a file name of my own invention, dickens.sql. And so that's where it's going to go. Now, I could put a full path in there, but because I have just listed a file name, that will go into the same directory that I currently happen to be in. All right, let's take this out for a spin and just see how it works. All right, here in the terminal window, again, just to repeat, because this is a mistake people make all the time, I am not in MySQL. We run this from outside the database. So I have not gotten into MySQL. I'm just here in the command line on my Macintosh. And if you're on Windows, get into the MySQL shell. Now, I've created a new folder here called backup, and I'm just going to do a directory listing. There are no files in backup right now. And so I'm going to paste in here, I already typed out, and I'm going to paste the MySQL dump line that I'm going to use. And so you can see, I scroll my cursor over really slowly. I'll go to this. I have MySQL dump on the left-hand side here. Now -u says log in as the following root user. I'm not logging in as root, I'm logging in as myself. It's going to ask me for my password on the next line. It's going to say interpret anything that doesn't look like a switch as the name of a database. I'm going to add the drop database line at the top, and I'm going to dump the one that we've been working on in the last couple of videos. So that the name of that database is books, and I'm going to dump that into a file called booksbackup.sql. And so now it will ask me for my password, if I can think and type at the same time. There you go. Now it looks like nothing happened, but if I do a listing again, you'll notice that booksbackup.sql is here. All right, so now if I go in, I've already opened this up, but if I look at the dump file, it looks just like this. So we've seen a lot of these things already, right? So anything that starts with a minus is ignored by MySQL, and so these are human-readable comments. There is an older style of comment that looks like this, and that's just for old versions of MySQL. So these are commands to MySQL that will be ignored by older versions of MySQL. So they execute for new versions, but they're ignored for old versions. You'll notice that it's using a character set here. And so here are the comments that we want. So current database is books. And again, this is going to be ignored by older databases, but it will be executed by new ones. And it says drop database if exists books. Now that was the add drop database switch that added that. And now what will happen is it will create a database, create database books, default character set UTF-8. Great. Now there's a little, I know this is confusing. For older versions of MySQL, this is a comment, and so it's really saying create the database if it doesn't exist, using the default character set UTF-8. So this looks a little goofy. This maybe is not how we would write the SQL if we were writing it by hand, but that's how it works. You'll notice some familiar stuff here. Use books, and now it's going to work on the table structure for book. And so you see, if the book table exists, it will drop it or delete it, and then it will recreate it. So we're going to set the character set to UTF-8, and we're going to create the table book, which is exactly how we defined it before. It might look a little different here, but that's okay. You can see the basics, right? Create table book, ID, small int unsigned, not null, auto increment. It just puts the primary key down at the bottom, but everything is there. Then we're dumping the data for the table book. Now, what it's doing is it's locking the table. And so if we had multiple users, it says, hey, we have exclusive access to the book table right now until we unlock it right down here. And so here's an insert statement. Insert into book, and you'll notice that it does not list the columns because it dumps every column, right? That makes sense. And here are the values, right? So here's book number 1, and then you'll see a comma, and here's book number 2, and then you see a comma, and here's book number 3. So this is a third variation on the insert statement, one we haven't seen before, but it's very compressed and it runs very, very, very fast. Could we do this on the command line? Yeah, absolutely we could. This is a variation on an insert statement that is totally valid. And we'll go through the same thing. So here's the stuff for the table called person, and we lock the table, we write data, we unlock the table, and so we just go all of the way through, and then we're done. And so here's where our dump was completed. Now, could I edit this by hand? Absolutely. I can change any of the stuff I want to. Like, let's just imagine that I wanted to change the name of the table called book. Could I do it here? Yeah, I could. So when I reload this, or when I source this later, then books will be called something else. The book table will be called something else. One more quickly before we go, I just want to add one more switch here. So I'm just going to go backwards. I'm still going to dump books, but I'm going to add a new switch, which is called, Craig, you can't spell that, no data. So what this is going to do is it's going to dump the structure of the database, the create database, create tables, but it will not add any inserts. So let's imagine that one of my friends wants this database. I don't want to share my books, but he wants the structure of the database. So I'm just going to dump it with no data. And again, same thing. I'm going to put my password in. Now I just overwrote the last dump file, which is okay. So if I open this now, this is the new version of it. And what you can see is it's slightly different, right? Same thing. I create the database using books. I drop the book table if it exists, and then I rebuild it. And then you'll notice there is no data here, right? So I'm not saving any of the data. This is just the table structure itself, right? So MySQL dump has a variety of these options for you. So I'll show you in a minute where, just less than a minute, where you can find this stuff. But don't be afraid of changing up the switches here and get whatever you want out of MySQL dump. Here's the URL where you can learn more about MySQL dump. If you just Google MySQL dump options, and it will take you to this page where you can scroll through, and there are just a ton of these kinds of options that you can work with. And again, just figure out what you want in your dump file. And do I need data? Do I not need data? Do I want to add the create table? Or, do I want to skip those? Every possible option is open to you, and all kinds of other stuff too, about character sets and all kinds of things that probably none of us will really ever have to look at. But again, MySQL dump, very, very usable, very, very customizable, produces human-readable plaintext documents full of SQL. And we just source that to bring it back in. Again, we've created some of these source files now by hand, and I like to do that because it gets you used to thinking about a source file full of SQL, so that now when you get to MySQL dump, everything looks reasonably familiar. All right. Well, that's it with MySQL dump. Good luck with there's some joke there. I can't think of what it is. So anyway, good luck.